The moment the judge leaned forward and issued that warning, the entire tone of this case changed. And if you blinked, you might have missed just how serious it actually was. Because this wasn't a celebrity soundbite or a social media rumor. This was a courtroom signal that something at the core of this legal battle might not survive scrutiny, and when that happens in a case involving Hollywood power players, contracts, and allegations of coercion, the fallout can be massive. What's unfolding here isn't just about one document or one dispute. It's about whether a contract that sits at the center of this conflict can legally stand at all. And more importantly, whether the way it was allegedly obtained crosses a line courts do not tolerate. And that's why people following this case closely are saying the judge's warning may have just cracked the foundation beneath everything Blake Lively's side is relying on. Here's why this moment matters so much and why legal analysts are paying attention. In contract law, consent isn't optional. It's the oxygen that keeps an agreement alive. If a judge even begins to question whether a contract was signed under pressure, intimidation, or coercive circumstances, that contract doesn't just weaken, it becomes radioactive. Courts do not like contracts that smell like leverage instead of agreement. And they especially don't like when contracts are used as weapons rather than safeguards. The word that keeps coming up in commentary around this case is coercion. And once that enters the conversation, judges are obligated to slow everything down and examine how that document came into existence. According to reporting and courtroom discussion surrounding the dispute, the concern isn't merely whether a contract exists, but how it was allegedly used afterward. When a judge signals that a contract may have been used in a way that resembles extortion rather than enforcement, that's not casual language, that's judicial caution bordering on alarm. Courts treat extortion claims with extreme seriousness because they undermine the integrity of civil agreements altogether. If contracts can be forced, then leverage to pressure behavior, the entire legal framework collapses. That's why the judge's warning didn't just raise eyebrows. It sent shockwaves through observers who understand how rare and consequential that kind of judicial language is. Now pause here for a second, because this is where the story gets even more intense, and if you're still watching, this is where I want to hear from you. Do you think powerful celebrities are held to the same legal standards as everyone else when contracts are involved, or do you believe fame quietly changes the rules behind the scenes? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this case is forcing that exact question into the open, and the answers aren't comfortable for anyone. What makes this situation so compelling isn't just the names attached to it. It's the legal domino effect that could follow if the judge decides the contract is legally compromised. If the court determines that consent was not freely given, then any actions based on that contract become vulnerable. That includes enforcement attempts, legal threats, and even strategic pressure that may have followed. In other words, it's not just about tossing a document, it's about unraveling everything built on top of it. This is why legal commentators are saying that this case could flip direction entirely, depending on what happens next. And here's where Hollywood history quietly creeps into the background. This industry has long been criticized for power imbalances that don't always show up on paper, but are deeply felt in reality. When someone with influence presents a contract, the question courts increasingly ask is whether the person signing truly had a choice, not a technical choice, but a real one. And judges today are far more willing to interrogate that imbalance than they were a decade ago. That cultural shift matters here, because it changes how evidence is interpreted and how testimony is weighed. If the judge ultimately decides that the contract in question was signed under conditions that undermine voluntary consent, the legal consequences extend beyond this case. It sends a message that celebrity status does not insulate agreements from scrutiny, and that contracts used as pressure tools may not survive daylight. That's why this warning wasn't routine, it was strategic. Judges don't telegraph concerns unless they want both sides to understand the stakes. And make no mistake, the stakes here are enormous. Before we move deeper, take a second to hit subscribe if you want clear breakdowns of high-profile legal drama without the noise, and share this with someone who follows celebrity news but may not realize how serious this courtroom moment actually is. These cases move fast, and what happens next could rewrite the narrative. Completelia's observers, we're now watching a legal chessboard where one move could topple everything. Blake Lively's legal position, as reported, depends heavily on the legitimacy and enforceability of this contract if that pillar cracks. The entire strategy has to be rebuilt in real time under judicial supervision. That's not just difficult, it's dangerous in litigation. Courts do not give endless second chances when foundational issues emerge. And here's the part many people miss: judges don't warn casually. They warn to invite correction or prepare parties for impact when a judge flags a potential problem this serious. It often means they've already seen enough to be concerned, and they're giving counsel an opportunity to respond before the hammer falls. That doesn't mean the outcome is decided, but it does mean the court is no longer comfortable proceeding as if the contract is unquestionably valid. So the tension right now is unmistakable. Every filing, every response, every argument going forward will be filtered through this lens of coercion versus consent. And once that lens is applied, it rarely goes away. This is the point in cases like this where momentum shifts quietly before it explodes publicly. In the next part, we're going to break down exactly how contracts are evaluated for coercion, what courts look for when determining whether pressure crosses a legal line, and why this specific warning could spell trouble far beyond what headlines are currently suggesting. Stay with me, because this is where the story stops being celebrity gossip and starts becoming a serious legal reckoning. And before you go anywhere, answer this in the comments because it matters for what comes next. If a contract is signed under pressure but benefits both sides on paper, should it still be enforceable? Or should intent and power imbalance override the text? I want to know what you think. Once a judge raises the possibility that a contract may have been coerced, the legal conversation shifts into an entirely different gear. And this is where many people misunderstand just how fragile agreements can become under scrutiny. Courts do not look at contracts the way the public does. They don't just ask whether a document exists or whether signatures are present. They ask how the situation felt in real time. To the person signing it, was there pressure? Was there fear of consequences? Was there an imbalance so strong that refusal wasn't realistically an option? And when those questions start stacking up, the contract itself becomes less of a shield and more of a liability. That's exactly why this judge's warning landed with such force, because it suggests the court is no longer assuming the agreement was the product of free and equal negotiation. In cases involving alleged coercion, judges look for patterns, not just moments. They examine timelines, communications, power dynamics, and what happened immediately before and after the contract was signed. If there's evidence suggesting that the contract was followed by threats, legal pressure, or demands that go beyond what the agreement reasonably allows, that's where red flags start multiplying. Legal experts often describe this as the difference between enforcement and leverage. Enforcement is using a contract to protect agreed rights. Leverage is using a contract to force behavior through fear. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because courts tolerate the first and aggressively shut down the second. What adds intensity to this situation is how quickly a coercion argument can snowball once it's taken seriously. If a judge believes there's a real possibility that the contract was used as a tool to extract compliance or silence rather than resolve a dispute, the court may begin to question not just the contract, but the credibility of the strategy behind it. And once credibility comes into question, everything becomes harder to defend. Arguments that once seemed strong suddenly sound strategic instead of principled. Legal filings that once felt routine begin to look calculated. That shift is subtle but devastating when it happens. Now pause right here, because this is where I want you involved. If a contract is legally valid on paper but was signed in a situation where one side clearly held more power, should courts still enforce it exactly as written? Or should fairness override formal legality? Let me know what you think in the comments, because this exact dilemma sits at the heart of what the judge is now grappling with. Another reason this warning matters is because of how courts treat alleged extortion differently from standard contract disputes. Extortion is not about whether someone technically had a right to make a demand. It's about whether that demand was paired with a threat designed to leave the other party with no reasonable alternative. That's why judges tread carefully here. If a contract becomes part of a broader pattern that feels like pressure instead of protection, the court's job is to intervene before the legal system itself becomes a tool of coercion. And judges are particularly sensitive to this when public figures are involved. because the reputational stakes alone can create pressure that never needs to be spoken aloud. This is where the drama intensifies because the judge's warning doesn't just threaten one document, it threatens the narrative structure of the case. If the contract is weakened or set aside, the leverage it provided disappears instantly. That forces a legal reset. Arguments that relied on that agreement lose their footing. Timelines have to be re-examined, motives get questioned, and suddenly, the side that once appeared to be in control may find itself defending not just actions, but intent. That is a much harder position to argue from. And if you're finding this breakdown helpful so far, take a second to like and share this video. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep legal drama analysis matters, and it helps more people understand what's really happening beyond the headlines. What's especially compelling is how modern courts are increasingly willing to acknowledge the realities of influence and pressure, particularly in industries where careers, reputations, and access are controlled by a small number of powerful players. Judges are no longer blind to the idea that saying no can come with invisible costs. Losing opportunities, being labeled difficult, facing legal threats that drain time and money. These factors don't always appear in contracts, but they absolutely appear in courtrooms when judges decide whether consent was genuine. That's why this case has become more than just a dispute between two parties. It's become a test of how far courts are willing to go in examining the conditions surrounding agreements, not just their wording. And once that door opens, it rarely closes quickly. The judge's warning suggests that door is now open, and both sides know it. Here's the moment that many observers are watching closely. If the court decides to allow deeper examination into how this contract was obtained and used, discovery could expand, communications could be scrutinized, internal discussions could become relevant, and that's where cases often change dramatically. What starts as a contract dispute can quickly turn into a credibility battle. And credibility is not something you can rewrite once it's damaged. Before we move into the final stretch, let me ask you this, and I want real answers in the comments. Do you think courts should be more aggressive in protecting people from contracts signed under pressure, even if it creates uncertainty for businesses and individuals who rely on written agreements? Or does that open the door to endless disputes? Your answer actually mirrors the tension judges face every day. In the final part, we're going to look at what happens next, what legal paths are now on the table, and why this judge's warning may be remembered as the turning point that reshaped the entire case. This is where consequences replace speculation and where the outcome starts to come into focus. Stay with me, because part 3 is where everything collides. At this stage of the case, the warning from the judge has effectively drawn a line in the sand, and everything that happens next will revolve around whether that line gets crossed or erased. When courts reach this moment, outcomes tend to accelerate. There is rarely a long, quiet middle anymore. Either the concerns raised by the judge are addressed with convincing clarity, or the court moves toward limiting, reshaping, or outright discarding the agreement at issue. That's what makes this phase so volatile. The pressure is no longer theoretical, it's procedural. And both sides know that the next filings and hearings could determine not just who wins, but how the case will be remembered if the contract is ultimately tossed or sidelined. The ripple effects will be immediate. Legal leverage disappears overnight. Arguments that depended on the contract's authority lose their backbone. The case would then pivot away from enforcement and toward justification. Why was the agreement presented the way it was? Why was it relied upon so heavily? And why did it trigger concerns serious enough for a judge to step in? Courts don't ask those questions lightly, and once they are on the table, they don't go away quietly. What many viewers don't realize is that judges often use warnings as a final off-ramp before consequences hit. It's a moment where the court is effectively saying fix this or prepare for impact. That doesn't mean the court has already decided, but it does mean patience is thinning. When warnings are ignored or inadequately addressed, courts respond decisively. That's why legal observers are calling this the turning point. Not because of what has already happened, but because of what may now be unavoidable. There's also the broader implication that hangs over this case like a shadow. If the contract is deemed problematic due to coercion or misuse, it reinforces a growing judicial trend that prioritizes substance over form. In simpler terms, Courts are increasingly willing to look past the paper and into the reality behind it. That trend matters far beyond this dispute. It affects how future contracts are negotiated, how power is exercised, and how accountability is enforced when influence is uneven. This case could quietly become a reference point long after the headlines fade. Now, let me ask you something that goes straight to the heart of why this story resonates so strongly. If courts begin rejecting contracts more often based on power, imbalance, and pressure, does that protect fairness? Or does it create uncertainty that weakens the value of agreements altogether? Put your take in the comments, because this debate doesn't end with this case. It's shaping the future of how disputes like this are handled as the legal path forward narrows. One thing becomes clear: this is no longer about public perception or media spin. Courtrooms don't reward narratives, they reward evidence. And the judge's warning signals that the court wants answers that go deeper than surface explanations. That demand changes how lawyers argue, how strategies evolve, and how much risk each side is willing to tolerate. At this point, even small missteps can have outsized consequences. If you've made it this far, you're seeing why retention spikes around stories like this. The tension isn't manufactured, it's procedural. It's the slow tightening of legal standards around a document that once seemed solid and now looks increasingly fragile. That shift is what keeps people watching, because it mirrors something deeply human: the moment when authority questions power and certainty gives way to scrutiny. Take a second right now to subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this, where legal reality meets high-stakes drama. And share this with someone who thinks celebrity cases are just gossip, because what's happening here is far more consequential than that as this case moves forward. Every new development will be measured against the judge's initial warning. Did the parties address the concern? Did they clarify the circumstances? Or did they double down on a strategy that the court has already signaled discomfort with? Those answers will determine whether this case stabilizes or collapses under its own weight. And here's the final hook that keeps legal analysts watching closely. When a judge signals discomfort early, and that discomfort isn't convincingly resolved, the court often takes control of the narrative. That's when rulings become firmer, timelines shorten, and outcomes arrive faster than anyone expects. If that happens here, this warning will be remembered as the moment everything shifted. So, before you click away, answer this honestly. Do you think this judge's warning was a routine legal checkpoint, or the first sign that the entire case may unravel? Let me know in the comments, because the next move in this courtroom could make that answer very clear. And remember, cases like this don't end with a bang, they end with a ruling. And when that ruling comes, it will trace its roots back to moments exactly like this one.